The first bolt of lightning tore across the Montana sky like God's own fury, illuminating Hank Dawson's weathered face as he urged his exhausted mare forward through the gathering storm. The year was 1878, and the unforgiving wilderness of the Montana Territory cared little for a man's plans or past. It only tested his will to survive. Hank pulled his drenched coat tighter as rain pelted his broad shoulders. 3 years working as a ranch hand after the war had hardened him, but even he knew when nature demanded respect. He'd been pushing too hard to reach his newly purchased homestead before nightfall, a stubborn decision he now regretted as thunder cracked overhead. "Easy, Belle," he murmured to his horse, patting her soaked neck. "We'll find shelter soon enough." That's when he heard it, a sound that shouldn't exist out here in the wilderness, especially not during a storm like this. A baby's cry, faint but unmistakable, somehow cutting through the howling wind. Hank reined in his horse, tilting his head to listen. The cry came again, more desperate this time. Without hesitation, he turned Belle toward the sound, squinting through the curtain of rain. About 50 yards ahead, barely visible through the downpour, stood a lone figure beneath a lightning-struck pine. As he approached, the figure came into focus, a woman, her dress clinging to her thin frame, huddled against the tree trunk. In her arms, she clutched a small bundle from which the pitiful wails emanated. "Madam," Hank called out, dismounting quickly. "You can't stay here." The woman's head jerked up, revealing a face both beautiful and terrified. Her dark hair hung in wet ropes around her pale cheeks. When lightning flashed again, Hank could see her eyes were wide with fear and fever. "Please," she whispered, her voice nearly lost to the storm. "Help us." In her arms, the baby continued to cry, its tiny face scrunched in distress. The woman swayed dangerously, and Hank lunged forward just in time to catch her as her knees buckled. "I've got you," he said, supporting her weight with one arm while keeping the baby secure between them. "What's your name, madam?" "Hannah," she managed, her eyes struggling to focus on his face. "Hannah Elliott. And this is Emma." The baby's cries grew more insistent, and Hannah looked down at her child with such desperate love that something in Hank's chest constricted.
"I'm Hank Dawson."
"My place is about 2 miles from here. Can you ride?" Hannah nodded weakly, though Hank doubted she could stay upright for long. With careful movements, he helped her onto Belle, then handed up the baby before mounting behind them. He wrapped one arm securely around Hannah's waist, feeling the heat of fever through her soaked clothes. "Hold on tight to Emma," he instructed, gathering the reins. "I'll get you both somewhere dry." The journey to Hank's homestead seemed endless, with the storm growing more violent with each passing minute. Hannah leaned heavily against his chest, her breathing shallow, while the baby had fallen into an exhausted sleep despite the downpour. Hank's property finally came into view, a modest cabin with a small barn beside it. He'd purchased it sight unseen 3 weeks earlier, a reckless decision spurred by years of drifting after the war. Now, as he guided Belle toward the shelter of the barn, he was thankful for solid walls and a roof, meager as they might be. "We're here," he said, dismounting carefully before helping Hannah down. "Let's get you inside." The cabin was sparsely furnished: a bed, a table with 2 chairs, a small cook stove, and little else. Hank had planned to build up his supplies over time, never expecting his first night would include unexpected guests. He helped Hannah to the bed, noting with concern how her skin burned to the touch. The baby stirred and began to fuss again as Hannah laid her gently on the quilt. "She's hungry," Hannah whispered, her voice fading. "But I haven't. I'm not well enough to." "I'll build a fire," Hank said quickly, moving to the small wood pile by the stove. "Get you both warmed up." As flames began to lick at the kindling, Hank turned back to find Hannah struggling to stay conscious, her hand protectively on her daughter's tiny chest. "When's the last time you ate, madam?" he asked, rummaging through his saddlebags for the jerky and hardtack he carried. "Yesterday, maybe," she murmured, her eyes closing despite her efforts. "There's in my bag." For the first time, Hank noticed the small cloth satchel hanging from her shoulder. Inside, he found a glass bottle with a rubber nipple attachment, one of those new feeding bottles he'd seen in a general store catalog, and a small tin of condensed milk. "You rest now," he said, taking the items. "I'll tend to Emma." Hannah's eyes flew open, panic momentarily overriding her exhaustion. "You know how to care for a baby?" Hank gave her what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "I helped raise my sister's young ones before I came west. I can manage for now." Relief washed over Hannah's face as she surrendered to exhaustion. "Thank you," she whispered before slipping into unconsciousness. For the next hour, Hank worked methodically, stoking the fire, preparing the milk according to the instructions on the tin, awkwardly but effectively feeding the hungry infant. As Emma drank greedily from the bottle, her tiny hand wrapped around his calloused finger, Hank felt something unfamiliar stir within him, a protective instinct he hadn't experienced since the war. After settling the now content baby beside her mother, Hank turned his attention to Hannah. Her fever was concerning, her breathing labored. With gentle hands, he placed a cool cloth on her forehead and covered both mother and child with his spare blanket. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, Hank watched over his unexpected charges with a vigilance that surprised even him. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, as lightning still occasionally illuminated the cabin's interior, he realized with startling clarity that his solitary life had been irreversibly altered. "Looks like it's just us tonight," he murmured to the sleeping pair. "But you're safe now. I promise you that." When morning broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a washed clean world and a sky of impossible blue. Hank, who had dozed fitfully in a chair by the bed, woke to the sound of Emma's hungry cries. Hannah still burned with fever, barely conscious, as Hank gently lifted the baby. "I'll take care of her," he assured Hannah, whose eyes flickered open briefly. "You just rest." As he prepared another bottle for Emma, Hank considered his options. Hannah needed a doctor, but the nearest town, Silver Creek, was a good 15 miles away. He couldn't leave them alone, but neither could he risk moving Hannah in her condition. His dilemma was interrupted by a knock at the door. Holding Emma securely against his chest, he opened it to find old Jim Peterson, his nearest neighbor from 3 miles down the valley. "Thought I'd check on you after that storm," Jim said, his weathered face creasing in surprise at the sight of Hank holding a baby. "Didn't know you had company, Dawson. Found them in the storm last night," Hank explained quickly. "The mother's sick with fever. I need to get her to a doctor." Jim peered past Hank to the still form on the bed. "That looks bad. My Martha had a touch for healing before she passed. Let me have a look." After examining Hannah, Jim's expression was grim. "Pneumonia, I reckon. She needs willow bark tea for the fever and some of that new store-bought medicine if you can get it." "I'll ride to town," Hank decided. "Can you stay with them?" Jim nodded, settling into the chair by the bed. "Been a while since I held a little one, but I reckon I can manage." Hank hesitated, surprised by his reluctance to leave Emma and Hannah, even in capable hands. "The bottle and milk are on the table. She'll need feeding again in a couple hours." "Go on," Jim urged. "Sooner you're back, better her chances." The ride to Silver Creek was the fastest Hank had ever made, pushing Belle harder than was wise after her exertions the previous day. The town was a modest collection of wooden buildings strung along a single dirt street, with the doctor's office situated between the general store and the blacksmith.
Dr.
Samuel Wilson was just opening his practice when Hank arrived, breathless and urgent. "Pneumonia, you say?" the doctor confirmed after hearing Hank's description. "Young woman with an infant? That's serious business." "Will you come?" Hank asked, already gathering the medicines the doctor recommended from his shelves. Dr. Wilson studied Hank's face. 15 miles is a long way, Mr. Dawson. My services don't come cheap. Hank emptied his money pouch onto the counter without hesitation. I've got $12.38. It's all I have right now, but I'm good for the rest. Something in his desperation must have convinced the doctor, who nodded slowly. Let me get my bag. We'll take my buggy. It'll be easier on the mother when we bring her back. The return journey seemed endless to Hank, who rode alongside the doctor's buggy, his thoughts fixed on the woman and child he'd left behind. He couldn't explain, even to himself, why their welfare mattered so much after just one night. When they finally arrived at the cabin, Hank was alarmed to find Hannah thrashing weakly in the bed, her face flushed with fever, while Jim awkwardly tried to soothe the crying Emma. "Thank the Lord you're back," Jim said, relief evident in his voice. "She took a turn about an hour ago. Been calling for someone named Thomas." Dr. Wilson moved swiftly to Hannah's side, his experienced hands checking her pulse and temperature. "She's burning up. Help me get some medicine into her." For the next hour, they worked together, the doctor directing, Hank and Jim assisting. When Hannah finally settled into a more peaceful sleep, Dr. Wilson stepped back with a sigh. "She's young and strong, which helps, but she's been through something difficult recently." He glanced at the baby, now contentedly sleeping in Hank's arms. "The child seems healthy enough, though. How old would you say she is?" Hank looked down at Emma's tiny face. "I'm not sure. A few months, maybe." 3 or 4 months, I'd guess, the doctor agreed. "Mr. Dawson, I think it best if we move them to town. I can provide better care there, and the church ladies can help with the baby." Something tightened in Hank's chest at the thought. "No," he said, more forcefully than intended. "I mean, moving her now might be dangerous. I can care for them here."
Dr.
Wilson raised an eyebrow. "It's a lot to ask of a bachelor, taking care of a sick woman and an infant." "I gave my word I'd keep them safe," Hank said simply. "I'll manage." After some discussion, the doctor reluctantly agreed, leaving medicines and detailed instructions before promising to return in 2 days. "You're taking on quite a responsibility," Jim commented after the doctor left. "You don't even know who they are or where they came from." Hank gazed down at Hannah's peaceful face, remembering her desperation the night before. "Doesn't matter. They needed help and they found me. That's enough." Jim studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Well, Martha would have my hide if I didn't offer to help. I'll bring over some of her preserved vegetables and maybe a chicken for broth. Woman needs strength to fight off that fever." After Jim departed, Hank found himself alone with his unexpected charges. Emma woke hungry, and he carefully prepared another bottle, cradling her close as she fed. "Your mama's going to be just fine," he promised the infant, who gazed up at him with solemn blue eyes. "And until she's better, you and I will get along just fine." As darkness fell, Hank settled into the chair beside the bed, one hand resting near Hannah's in case she woke disoriented, the other cradling Emma on his chest. Tomorrow would bring challenges he couldn't yet imagine, but for tonight, his duty was clear. The next 5 days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and busy days. Hannah's fever broke on the 3rd day, leaving her weak but lucid. The doctor, true to his word, returned twice to check on her progress, pronouncing her on the road to recovery during his 2nd visit. "You've done well by them, Dawson," he said privately as he prepared to leave. Not many men would have taken on such a responsibility. Hank merely nodded, uncomfortable with the praise. Any decent man would have done the same. Dr. Wilson smiled knowingly. "I've been practicing medicine in these parts for 15 years. Decency isn't as common as you might hope." Once Hannah was strong enough to sit up, Hank helped her to the table for simple meals of broth and bread, watching with satisfaction as color gradually returned to her cheeks. Emma, meanwhile, had adapted to Hank's care with surprising ease, her tiny face lighting up whenever he approached. She likes you, Hannah observed softly on the sixth evening, watching as Hank paced the cabin floor with Emma nestled against his shoulder. Hank glanced up, momentarily embarrassed to be caught humming a lullaby to the infant. She's an easy baby. Hardly cries except when she's hungry. Hannah smiled, the expression transforming her face in a way that made Hank's heart skip unexpectedly. She's usually fussier. You must have a natural touch. Had practice with my sister's children, he explained, gently placing the now sleeping Emma in the makeshift cradle he'd constructed from a wooden crate lined with blankets. 3 of them under 5 when I last saw them. Where are they now? Hannah asked, her voice still weak, but gaining strength each day. Hank hesitated, unaccustomed to sharing his past. Ohio. My sister married a shopkeeper there before the war. You must miss them. I do, Hank admitted, surprised by his own candor.
We
lost touch after I joined up. War changes a man. When I came back, it seemed better to make a fresh start out west. Hannah nodded, understanding in her eyes. Fresh starts are valuable things. Emma and I are looking for one ourselves. It was the perfect opening to ask the questions that had been burning in Hank's mind since finding her. Who was she running from? Where was she headed? Who was Thomas? But something in her expression, a careful guardedness beneath the gratitude, stopped him. Well, you're welcome here until you're fully recovered, he said instead, moving to stoke the fire. No rush. Hannah's eyes welled with unexpected tears. Thank you, Mr. Dawson. Your kindness is more than we deserve. Hank, he corrected gently. And kindness isn't about deserving. It's just what folks should do for each other. That night, as Hannah slept peacefully with Emma beside her, Hank sat on the cabin's small porch, watching stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. For the first time since leaving Ohio, he felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with survival or forgetting the past. These 2 lost souls had awakened something in him he'd thought long dead: hope. As Hannah's strength returned, a routine developed in the small cabin. Mornings began with Hank tending to the outdoor chores while Hannah cared for Emma. Afternoons often found them working together, Hannah insisting on helping with cooking or mending clothes, despite Hank's protests that she should rest. I've been resting for a week, she said firmly on the 8th day, taking the wooden spoon from his hand as he attempted to stir a pot of beans. I'm not an invalid anymore, and I won't be a burden. You're not a burden, Hank assured her, reluctantly surrendering the spoon. But the doctor said I needed to regain my strength, and I won't do that by lying in bed all day. Her tone was gentle but determined. Besides, your cooking could use some improvement. Hank couldn't help laughing, a rusty sound he barely recognized as his own. Fair enough. I never claimed to be handy in a kitchen. Hannah smiled, the gesture transforming her face in a way that made Hank's chest tighten. Consider it payment for your hospitality. I may not have money, but I can at least make sure you eat properly. The simple meals Hannah prepared from Hank's limited supplies were indeed vastly superior to his own efforts. More than that, though, was the comfort of sitting down to eat together, the cabin filled with quiet conversation instead of the silence he'd grown accustomed to over years of solitary living. As Hannah moved about the cabin with increasing confidence, Hank found himself watching her, the gentle way she handled Emma, the grace in her movements as she worked, the thoughtful expression that sometimes crossed her face when she gazed out the window toward the distant mountains. You're planning to move on, he observed one evening as they sat on the porch, Emma sleeping peacefully in Hannah's arms. Hannah looked startled, then resigned.
Yes.
Once I'm strong enough to travel. She hesitated, then added softly, We've imposed on your kindness long enough. It's not an imposition, Hank said quickly. I mean, there's no rush. Winter will be here before long, and traveling with a baby. We need to reach California before the pass is close, Hannah explained, not meeting his eyes. I have a cousin in Sacramento who's expecting us. The news shouldn't have disappointed him as much as it did. After all, he'd known from the beginning that their presence in his life was temporary, a chance encounter during a storm, nothing more. "California's a long way," he said finally. "Especially alone." Hannah's fingers tightened slightly around Emma. "We'll manage. We've come this far already." Hank wanted to ask how far exactly and from where, but Hannah's expression discouraged questions. Instead, he said, "There's a wagon train leaving from Silver Creek next week, heading to California before the winter sets in. Might be safer than traveling alone." Hope flashed across Hannah's face. "A wagon train? Are you certain?" Hank nodded. "Jim mentioned it when he stopped by yesterday. Said they're looking for more families to join, make the journey safer." "I'll need supplies," Hannah murmured, more to herself than to Hank. "And passage costs money." "I've been saving to buy cattle," Hank found himself saying. "I can spare enough to get you outfitted proper." Hannah's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "I couldn't possibly accept that. You've done far too much already." "Consider it a loan, then," Hank suggested, though they both knew her chances of repaying him were slim. "Your cousin can send it back once you're settled." Tears welled in Hannah's eyes. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." It was a fair question, one Hank had asked himself repeatedly over the past week. Why had this woman and her child come to matter so much? Why did the thought of them leaving create such an ache in his chest? "I know enough," he said simply. "I know you're brave and determined. I know you love your daughter fiercely. And I know that sometimes folks just need a helping hand." Hannah studied his face for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Thank you, Hank. We'll find a way to repay your kindness someday." The next morning, Hank rode into Silver Creek to confirm the details of the wagon train and purchase supplies. The general store owner, Walter Hayes, raised his eyebrows at Hank's list. "Outfitting for a family trip, Dawson? Didn't know you had womenfolk." "Just helping some travelers get to California," Hank explained, uncomfortable with the storekeeper's curiosity. "These travelers wouldn't happen to be a pretty young woman and a baby, would they?" Walter asked shrewdly. "Doc Wilson mentioned you'd taken in some strays during that big storm." Hank's jaw tightened. "They're not strays. The lady's name is Mrs. Elliott, and she's joining the Silver Creek wagon train once she's fully recovered." Walter's expression shifted subtly. "Elliott, you say? Don't suppose her given name is Hannah?" Something in the man's tone put Hank on alert. "What of it?" Walter glanced around the store to ensure they were alone before leaning across the counter. "There was a fella in here about 5 days ago. Well-dressed Easterner, asking after a young woman with a baby. Said his name was Thomas Elliott, and he was looking for his wife who'd run off with their child." Hank's blood ran cold. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing to tell. Hadn't heard of any woman with a baby in these parts at that time." Walter studied Hank's face. "But if this Hannah is the same woman, seems like she's running from her husband. That's a serious matter, Dawson." "Did he say why she might have run?" Hank asked carefully. Walter shook his head. "Just that she was confused after the baby came. Mentioned something about her needing doctors back east. Offered a $50 reward for information leading to their return." $50 was more than most ranch hands made in 3 months. Hank's mouth went dry at the thought of what such a sum might tempt people to do. Where'd this man go after asking his questions? Said he was checking all the settlements in the territory. Headed toward Helena next, I believe. Hank completed his purchases in thoughtful silence, his mind racing. Hannah had never mentioned a husband, though he'd assumed Emma's father was somewhere in the picture. Was she truly running from her child's father? And if so, what had driven her to such desperate measures? On the ride back to his cabin, Hank wrestled with what to do. He had no right to question Hannah about her past, yet if she was in some kind of danger, or worse, if she posed a danger to Emma as her husband had implied, he needed to know. Hannah was sitting on the porch when he returned, Emma contentedly nursing at her breast. She covered herself modestly as Hank approached, a blush coloring her cheeks. "Forgive me," she said. "I didn't expect you back so soon." "No need for apologies," Hank replied, deliberately busying himself with unloading the supplies to give her privacy. "It's a natural thing." When Emma had finished and Hannah had adjusted her clothing, Hank joined her on the porch, his expression serious. "There's something we need to discuss," he began carefully. "In town today, I heard something troubling." Hannah's face paled. "He's here?" "In Silver Creek." The fear in her voice confirmed Hank's suspicions. "Not anymore. But a man named Thomas Elliott was asking after a woman and baby about 5 days ago, offering reward money for information." Hannah's arms tightened protectively around Emma, who stirred in protest. "Did anyone tell him about us?"
No.
"No one knew about you then." "But Hannah, I need to understand what's happening." Hank leaned forward, his eyes earnest. "If you're in trouble, I want to help. But I can't do that if I don't know the truth." For a long moment, Hannah was silent, her eyes fixed on Emma's face. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Thomas is my husband. We married 2 years ago in Boston, where his family owns shipping interests." She swallowed hard.
He was charming, attentive.
"I thought I was fortunate to have caught the eye of such a well-regarded gentleman." Hank remained silent, giving her space to continue at her own pace. "After the wedding, things
changed.
Thomas became controlling, then cruel. When I discovered I was expecting Emma, I hoped it might soften him, but it only made things worse." Her voice faltered. "He drank heavily, and when he drank, he used his fists." Anger flared in Hank's chest, hot and immediate. "He beat you? While you were carrying his child?" Hannah nodded, a single tear sliding down her cheek.
He was careful, though.
"Never where it would show. Never where his family, or our social circle, might notice." "Why didn't you leave then?" Hank asked gently. "Where would I go? My parents died in the fever epidemic when I was 16. I had no family, no money of my own." She shook her head sadly. "Besides, I truly believed having the baby would change him. But it didn't."
No.
When Emma was born, he seemed disappointed she wasn't a son. He barely acknowledged her existence. Hannah's voice strengthened with anger. "Then, when she was 2 months old, I overheard him discussing sending me to a sanitarium, a mental asylum, claiming I was suffering from female hysteria and unfit to care for my child." Hank had heard of such places, where inconvenient wives were sometimes sent and forgotten. "He was going to take Emma from you and lock me away forever," Hannah confirmed. "That night, I took what little money I could find in his study, some of Emma's things, and fled. We've been traveling west ever since, taking odd jobs when my money ran low. And now he's tracking you." Hannah looked up, her eyes filled with determination despite her fear. "I won't go back, Hank. I'll die before I let him lock me away and harm my daughter." Without thinking, Hank reached out to cover her hand with his own. "No one's sending you anywhere you don't want to go. Not while I'm breathing." The fierceness of his own response surprised him, but he meant every word. In the 2 weeks since finding Hannah and Emma in the storm, they had awakened something in him he'd thought long dead, a desire to protect, to care for someone beyond himself. "What will we do?" Hannah asked, turning her hand to grasp his. "The wagon train leaves in 5 days. If Thomas returns to Silver Creek before then." "You won't be here," Hank decided. "We'll leave tomorrow for my sister's place in Ohio. Thomas won't think to look for you there." Hannah's eyes widened. "Ohio? But you said you haven't spoken to your sister in years." "Margaret has a good heart. She'll help us once she understands the situation." Hank squeezed her hand gently. "It's safer than trying for California, with a man hunting you. We can take the train most of the way."
"We,"
Hannah repeated. "Hank, I can't ask you to leave your home, your plans. You're not asking. I'm offering. He looked around at the modest cabin and the land he'd barely begun to work. This place will still be here if we decide to return someday. The word "we" hung between them, filled with unspoken meaning. Hannah studied his face, searching for something doubt, perhaps, or ulterior motives. Whatever she saw must have reassured her, because she nodded slowly. If you're certain, she said softly, then yes. We'll go to Ohio. That night, as Hannah and Emma slept in the bed, Hank sat by the window, rifle across his knees, watching the moonlit yard for any sign of trouble. He knew his impulsive offer to take Hannah to Ohio hadn't fully registered with her yet, or with himself, for that matter. What was he doing? Abandoning his homestead, the fresh start he'd worked so hard for. And for what? A woman he barely knew and her infant daughter? Yet when he tried to imagine returning to his solitary existence after they left, the thought was unbearable. Somehow, in just 2 weeks, Hannah's quiet strength and Emma's innocent trust had become essential to him, filling a void he hadn't realized existed. By morning, Hank had formulated a plan. They would leave at dawn, taking the back trails to avoid Silver Creek entirely. His neighbor Jim could watch the property until Hank returned if he returned. The future beyond reaching Ohio remained foggy, undefined, but the immediate path was clear. Hannah was already awake when Hank entered the cabin after tending to the horses, Emma contentedly playing with a wooden spoon in her lap. "I've been thinking about your plan," she said without preamble. "It's too much, Hank. You can't uproot your life for us." Hank sat beside her at the table, choosing his words carefully. "When I came west after the war, I was running too. Not from a person, but from memories, from what I'd seen and done." He met her eyes steadily. "I know what it's like to feel hunted, Hannah. I won't let you face that alone. But your land, your dreams. Land is just dirt without the right people to share it with," Hank interrupted gently. "As for dreams, well, sometimes they change when we least expect it." Hannah fell silent, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Finally, she asked, "What if your sister won't have us? Then we'll find another way. Together." Hank reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of touching hers. "I'm not asking for promises, Hannah. I know your trust doesn't come easy after what you've been through. I'm just asking you to let me help keep you and Emma safe." After a long moment, Hannah nodded, her hand moving to cover his. Together, then. They left as planned the next morning, traveling cross-country to avoid the main roads. Hannah rode Belle, Emma securely bundled against her chest, while Hank led them on foot. By midday, they reached the railroad stop at Coopersville, a smaller settlement where Thomas Elliot was less likely to have made inquiries. The station master barely glanced at them as Hank purchased 3 tickets east, his assumption that they were a family, allowing them to pass without question. As the train pulled away from the platform, Anna's shoulders finally relaxed, her expression lightening for the first time since Hank had mentioned Thomas's presence in the territory. "I never thought I'd escape Montana," she admitted quietly as they settled into their seats, Emma sleeping peacefully between them. "Each day, I expected him to find us." "We're not free yet," Hank cautioned, "but we've made a good start." The journey east was long but uneventful. They changed trains in Chicago, where Hank splurged on a hotel room for Hannah and Emma while he kept watch in the lobby. By the time they reached Columbus, Ohio, 5 days had passed without incident, allowing Hank to hope they had truly escaped Thomas's pursuit. The final leg of their journey was by stagecoach to the small town of Millfield, where Hank's sister had settled with her husband before the war. As the coach rattled down the main street, Hank found himself suddenly nervous. What if Margaret didn't welcome him after all these years? What if she refused to believe Hannah's story? The coach stopped outside the general store, and Hank helped Hannah down, his eyes scanning the familiar yet changed storefronts. "Your sister's home is nearby?" Hannah asked, adjusting Emma in her arms. Her husband's store should be just down the street, Hank replied, gathering their meager belongings. Anderson's mercantile, unless things have changed. They found the store easily enough, a prosperous-looking establishment with polished windows and a freshly painted sign. Hank hesitated at the door, suddenly unsure. We can find somewhere else if you prefer, Hannah offered, sensing his discomfort.
Hank shook his head.
No, it's time I faced my past. With a deep breath, he pushed open the door, the familiar jingle of bells announcing their arrival. A portly man with kind eyes looked up from behind the counter. Good afternoon, folks. What can I help you with today? Hank removed his hat, his throat unexpectedly tight. I'm looking for Margaret Anderson. I'm her brother, Hank Dawson. The man's eyes widened, his mouth forming a perfect O of surprise. Hank? Margaret's Hank, who went west. At Hank's nod, he broke into a broad smile. Well, I'm Edward Anderson, your brother-in-law. Margaret's going to be beside herself with joy. Before Hank could respond, Edward was calling toward the back of the store. Maggie, come quick. You'll never believe who's here. A woman emerged from the storeroom, wiping her hands on her apron. She was older than Hank remembered, with strands of gray in her auburn hair, but her eyes, their mother's eyes, were exactly as he recalled. Hank, she whispered, one hand flying to her mouth. Is it really you? Hello, Maggie, Hank said, his voice rough with emotion. It's been a long time. With a small cry, Margaret rushed forward, throwing her arms around her brother. 8 years without a word. I thought you might be dead. I'm sorry, Hank murmured, returning her embrace awkwardly. After the war, I wasn't fit company for decent folks. Margaret pulled back, studying his face with tears in her eyes. You're my brother. You'll always be welcome in my home, no matter what. Only then did she seem to notice Hannah and Emma standing quietly behind Hank. Her eyebrows rose in question. This is Hannah Elliott and her daughter Emma, Hank explained.
We're.
He faltered, unsure how to describe their relationship. We're in some trouble, Hannah supplied calmly. Hank has been kind enough to help us. Margaret's gaze sharpened with interest, but to her credit, she asked no immediate questions. Instead, she smiled warmly at Hannah. Any friend of my brother's is welcome here. Edward, close up the store. Family is more important than business today. The Andersons lived in a comfortable home behind the store, where 3 children, 2 boys, and a girl greeted their long-lost uncle with curious excitement. After the initial flurry of introductions and exclamations over Emma's cherubic features, Margaret showed Hannah to a spare bedroom where she could rest and tend to the baby. Once Hannah was settled, Margaret cornered Hank in the kitchen, her expression brooking no evasion. Now, brother mine, perhaps you'd like to explain why you've appeared on my doorstep after 8 years of silence, with a young woman and baby in tow? Hank sighed, knowing his sister deserved the truth. As succinctly as possible, he related the events of the past 3 weeks, finding Hannah and Emma in the storm, nursing them back to health, and learning of Thomas Elliott's pursuit. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly troubled. When Hank finished, she sat heavily in a kitchen chair. So this Thomas has no idea you've come east? She asked. As far as he knows, we were headed to California with a wagon train, Hank confirmed. But a man with his resources might eventually think to check the passenger manifests for eastbound trains. Then you'll stay here until we can determine it's safe, Margaret decided. Edward's brother is a lawyer in Columbus. He might be able to help Hannah legally protect herself and Emma. Hank nodded gratefully. I was hoping you'd say that. I know it's an imposition. Margaret waved away his concerns. Nonsense. This is what family does. She fixed him with a penetrating gaze. Though I am curious about one thing, Hank. What exactly are your intentions toward Mrs. Elliott? The directness of the question caught Hank off guard. I'm just helping her, Maggie. She needed someone and I was there. Margaret murmured skeptically. And the fact that she's a beautiful young woman had nothing to do with it? Hank felt heat rise in his cheeks. It's not like that. Hannah's been through enough without some ranch hand making advances. So, you haven't developed feelings for her? Or for that baby? Margaret pressed, her expression softening. Because the way you look at them tells a different story, little brother. Hank stared down at his calloused hands, unable to deny the truth in his sister's observation. Doesn't matter what I feel. Hannah's running from one man who tried to control her life. Last thing she needs is another one. Margaret reached across the table to squeeze his hand. There's a world of difference between a man who offers his heart and one who uses his fists, Hank. Don't sell yourself short. Before Hank could respond, Hannah appeared in the doorway, Emma babbling happily in her arms. I'm sorry to interrupt, but this little one is getting hungry. Of course, Margaret said, rising quickly. Let me warm some milk for her. Unless you're... She gestured vaguely toward Hannah's chest. Hannah smiled. Emma's weaning now. She takes the bottle more often than not these days. As Margaret busied herself preparing a bottle, Hannah took the seat beside Hank, her eyes questioning. Is everything all right? I can find other arrangements if this is too complicated. Everything's fine, Hank assured her. Maggie and Edward are happy to have us stay as long as needed. And Edward's brother is a lawyer, Margaret added, testing the milk's temperature on her wrist before handing the bottle to Hannah. He might be able to help with your situation, legally speaking. Hope flashed across Hannah's face. A legal separation? Is that possible? Perhaps even a divorce, under the circumstances, Margaret suggested. Nathan will know better than I. He's coming for Sunday dinner tomorrow. That evening, seated around the Andersons' large dining table, Hank observed Hannah with his sister's family. She fit in seamlessly, helping Margaret with the meal preparations, engaging Edward in conversation about his business, and charming the children with her gentle humor. Emma, passed from one adoring cousin to another, basked in the attention, her infectious giggles filling the house with joy. Later, as Hannah tucked Emma into the cradle Edward had brought down from the attic, Hank lingered in the doorway of their room, reluctant to leave them even for the night. You seem happy here, he observed softly. Hannah looked up, her smile illuminated by the lamplight. It feels like a real home. Your sister is wonderful, Hank. She always was the best of us, he agreed, leaning against the doorframe. Our father was hard on me, but Maggie somehow smoothed his rough edges. She said you were always the protector, Hannah said, moving to stand before him. Even as a boy, she says you stood up for those who couldn't defend themselves. Hank shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Just did what seemed right. Like rescuing a desperate woman and her baby during a thunderstorm? Hannah's eyes held his, filled with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Or giving up your home to help them escape danger? Anyone would have done the same, Hank insisted. Hannah shook her head slowly. No, Hank. Not anyone. Not even most men. She hesitated, then reached up to touch his cheek gently. You're a rare kind of man, Hank Dawson. The kind I stopped believing existed after Thomas. Before Hank could respond, she rose on tiptoes and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek, then stepped back into her room. Good night, she whispered, closing the door quietly. Hank stood frozen in the hallway, his cheek burning where her lips had touched it, his heart hammering in his chest like a young boy's after his first dance. Eventually, he made his way to the small room Edward had prepared for him, though sleep was long in coming. The next day brought Nathan Anderson, Edward's brother and a respected attorney from Columbus. After dinner, while the children played in the yard under Edward's supervision, the adults gathered in the parlor to discuss Hannah's situation. Abandonment and cruelty are grounds for divorce in Ohio, Nathan explained after hearing Hannah's story. But there are complications. Your marriage took place in Massachusetts, and you've been residing in Montana territory. Jurisdiction becomes an issue. What about the threats to commit Mrs. Elliott to an asylum? Margaret asked. Surely that counts for something. Nathan nodded thoughtfully. It does strengthen the case, especially with Mr. Dawson as a witness to your condition when he found you. I wasn't present for any actual mistreatment, Hank pointed out. Just saw the aftermath. Your testimony regarding her physical state and fear would still be valuable, Nathan assured him. However, there's another approach we might consider. He turned to Hannah. How would you feel about simply disappearing? Hannah blinked in confusion. I don't understand. Legally speaking, if you can't be found, you can't be forced to return to your husband, Nathan clarified. With a new name, in a new place, you and Emma could start fresh without the lengthy and public process of a divorce. A new identity? Hannah considered the idea. Is that even possible? More common than you might think, especially out west, Nathan said. Many people reinvent themselves when they cross the Mississippi. With the right documentation which I can provide, Hannah Elliott could cease to exist. Hank leaned forward, intrigued despite his reservations. What about Emma? Doesn't a father have rights to his child? Rights he forfeited through abuse and abandonment, Nathan countered. Besides, without Hannah, he has no way to locate Emma. The room fell silent as Hannah contemplated the suggestion. Finally, she looked up, determination in her eyes. If I did this became someone new, where would we go? Thomas knows about Hank now. He might eventually think to look for me with his family. West again, Hank suggested. But not Montana. Maybe Oregon or Washington territory. Hannah's eyes met his.
We.
Hank nodded, suddenly certain. If you'll have my company. I meant what I said before together. Nathan cleared his throat, looking between them with professional detachment. For this plan to work most effectively, you would need to appear to be a family. A husband and wife traveling with their child attracts far less attention than a single woman with a baby. You mean? Hannah's voice trailed off as she grasped his implication. A marriage of convenience, at least on paper, Nathan confirmed. It would provide the strongest protection for both you and Emma. Margaret watched her brother's face closely. Hank, what are your thoughts on this? Hank's mind raced. A marriage, even one in name only, was a serious commitment, especially to a woman still legally tied to another man. Yet the thought of Hannah and Emma continuing their journey without his protection was unthinkable. I'll do whatever keeps them safest, he said finally, looking directly at Hannah. But only if it's truly what you want. You've had enough of men making decisions for you. Hannah's eyes filled with tears. After Thomas, I swore I'd never marry again. The very thought terrified me. She took a shaky breath. But you're not Thomas. You've never tried to control me or frighten me. You've only ever tried to help us. That doesn't mean you owe me anything, Hank said quickly. Least of all this. It's not about owing. Hannah's voice strengthened. It's about choosing. For the first time since I fled Boston, I feel I have a real choice. She looked around at the supportive faces surrounding her, then back to Hank. And I choose safety for Emma. I choose a new beginning. Then I'll stand with you, Hank promised, his heart thundering in his chest. For as long as you need. Nathan nodded approvingly. I'll prepare the necessary documents. You'll need new names, something common enough not to attract attention. Hannah can keep her first name, Hank suggested. It's common enough. But perhaps a different surname for both of you. Dawson, Hannah said quietly. If we're to appear a family, shouldn't we share your name? Actually, Nathan interjected, it might be safer if Hank adopts a new surname as well. Thomas Elliott knows to look for a Hank Dawson. After some discussion, they settled on the name Harrison for their new identity, a nod to Hank's father and Hannah's grandfather, who had shared the name Henry. Mr. and Mrs. Harrison. Margaret tested the name, smiling. It has a nice ring to it. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of preparation. Nathan procured the necessary documentation: a marriage certificate, birth record for Emma listing Hank as her father, and travel papers. Margaret helped Hannah sew appropriate clothing for their journey, while Edward advised Hank on business opportunities in Oregon, where they had decided to settle. Throughout it all, Hank and Hannah maintained a careful distance, their relationship cordial but reserved. Despite sharing meals and planning their future together, they never discussed the deeper implications of their arrangement. It was as if both feared that acknowledging the growing feelings between them might somehow jinx their plans. The night before their scheduled departure, Hank found Hannah on the back porch after Emma had been put to bed. She stood gazing at the stars, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the autumn chill. "Everything's set for morning," Hank said, joining her at the railing. "Train leaves at 8. Hannah nodded, her expression pensive. "It still doesn't seem real." Hannah Elliott disappearing forever, replaced by Hannah Harrison. "Having second thoughts?" Hank asked gently. "No," she said quickly. "Just contemplating how strange life is. 3 months ago, I was a desperate woman fleeing in the night. Now I'm about to travel across the country with a man I barely knew a month ago, pretending to be his wife." "We don't have to go through with this," Hank reminded her. "You could stay here with Maggie and Edward. They'd keep you safe." Hannah turned to face him fully, her eyes searching his in the moonlight. "Is that what you want? For me to stay here while you return west?" "What I want?" Hank hesitated, unaccustomed to voicing his desires. "What I want is for you and Emma to be safe and happy. If that's here without me, I can accept that. And if it's with you?" Hannah asked softly. "What then?" Hank swallowed hard, understanding the true question behind her words. "Then I'd consider myself the luckiest man alive to have you both in my life, in whatever capacity you choose." Hannah stepped closer, her hand coming to rest lightly on his chest. "Even after everything with Thomas, I never stopped believing in love, Hank. I just stopped believing I deserved it." "You deserve everything good in this world," Hank said fervently. "You and Emma both. So do you." Hannah's voice was barely above a whisper now. "The man who risks everything to save strangers deserves to be loved completely, without reservation." Hank's heart raced as he covered her hand with his own. "Hannah, I know you don't expect anything," she interrupted gently. "That's precisely why I find myself feeling things I thought were dead inside me." She took a deep breath. "This arrangement of ours, this marriage of convenience, I'm willing to make it real. Not immediately, not until we're settled and safe. But someday, when you're ready, if you still want me then." Hank couldn't restrain himself any longer. With infinite tenderness, he cupped her face in his hands. "I will want you every day for the rest of my life, Hannah Elliott. I've known it since I found you in that storm." When their lips met, it was like coming home after years of wandering. Hannah melted against him, her arms encircling his waist as the kiss deepened, filled with promise and hope. When they finally parted, both breathless, Hannah rested her forehead against his chest. "I'm still afraid," she admitted. "Of being found, of trusting again, of failing Emma somehow." "Fear's not always a bad thing," Hank said, stroking her hair gently. "It keeps us careful. But we won't let it stop us from living, from finding happiness together." "Together," Hannah repeated, the words sounding like a vow. "As a real family." "As a real family," Hank agreed, his heart fuller than he'd ever thought possible. "Tomorrow we start our new life as the Harrisons." The train journey west was long but filled with a sense of anticipation rather than fear. With each mile that passed beneath the wheels, Hannah's shoulders seemed to straighten, her smiles coming more easily. Emma, delighted by the rhythm of the train and the attention of fellow passengers, thrived under the pretense that she was traveling with both her parents. They settled initially in Portland, Oregon, where Hank found work with a lumber company while Hannah took in sewing. Their small rented house near the edge of town afforded them privacy while they adjusted to their new identities and relationship. True to her word, Hannah took things slowly between them. They maintained separate bedrooms, Hank insisting that Hannah and Emma take the larger one while he made do with the small back room. But each evening found them on the porch or by the fireplace, talking late into the night, sharing stories and dreams, falling more deeply in love with each passing day. 6 months after their arrival in Portland, on a clear spring evening with wildflowers blooming in their small garden, Hank knelt before Hannah with a simple gold band. "I know we already have papers saying we're married," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I want to make a real promise to you, Hannah Harrison. I want to be your husband in truth, not just in name. I want to be Emma's father in all the ways that matter." Tears glistened in Hannah's eyes as she extended her trembling hand. "I've been yours since that night on the porch in Ohio, Hank. I was just waiting for you to claim me." The ring slipped onto her finger as if it had always belonged there. That night, Hannah came to Hank's bed, and their pretend marriage became gloriously, passionately real. 2 years passed in relative tranquility. Hank's hard work and natural aptitude for business led to a promotion at the lumber company, allowing them to purchase a small house on the outskirts of town. Emma grew from an infant to a chattering toddler who idolized her papa and followed him everywhere. And Hannah, free from fear for the first time in years, blossomed into a confident woman whose quiet strength and dignity earned the respect of everyone she met. On Emma's 3rd birthday, as they watched her playing in the yard with neighborhood children, Hannah turned to Hank with a mysterious smile. "I have a gift for you," she said, taking his hand and placing it gently on her abdomen. "In about 7 months, Emma will have a little brother or sister." Joy, unlike anything Hank had ever known, surged through him. He gathered Hannah in his arms, lifting her off her feet in his excitement. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby." Hannah nodded, her own happiness radiant on her face. "Our family is growing, just as our love has." In the golden afternoon light, with Emma's laughter floating on the breeze and the promise of new life between them, Hank marveled at how a single act of kindness during a thunderstorm had led to such profound happiness. The war, his years of drifting, Hannah's suffering at Thomas's hands, all of it had somehow led them to this perfect moment. "I love you, Hannah Harrison," he said, kissing her tenderly. "You and Emma saved me as much as I ever helped you." "We saved each other," Hannah replied, resting her head against his chest. "And now we have forever to be grateful for that stormy night when you found us." As if on cue, Emma ran to them, arms outstretched for Hank to lift her high. "Papa, swing me," she demanded with the confidence of a child who knows she is deeply loved. Hank obliged, his heart so full it might burst. This was his family, the lost souls who had found each other in a storm and forged a bond stronger than blood. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, with love as their shelter against life's thunderstorms. And in the years that followed, as their family grew to include 2 more children, a son named James and another daughter they called Margaret, Hank and Hannah Harrison never forgot how their story began. On stormy nights, they would gather their children close and tell them the tale of a desperate woman, a helpless baby, and the cowboy whose act of compassion had created a family bound not by obligation or convention, but by the purest, most enduring love.